Wisdom in culture. That's our topic today. And you might think of it this way. How do we live wisely? How do we be wise in the world that we live in? As I was reflecting on this topic, kind of considering what passage to teach from, I felt impressed upon to teach from the book of Daniel. I had no idea at the time I was in California that Reggie would be also teaching from the book of Daniel, so it just kind of worked out happenstance that he was in the book of Daniel last week and we will be in the book of Daniel this week. Daniel chapter 1. I want to start off just kind of giving you a little bit of background context for this chapter. The big thing that I want to impress upon you is that the book of Daniel starts off in what was surely one of, if not the worst moments in the history of Israel as a nation. The nation of Israel had undergone some pretty sloppy rule, some pretty poor leadership. Their kings had led them astray, had led them away from the Lord, and as punishment for this people, the great empire of Babylon was brought upon them under the great king Nebuchadnezzar. And the Babylonians came and they seized control of the land of Israel. And on 3 different occasions, the army would come in, would defeat the Israelite armies, would tear down their homes and their cities, and ultimately would tear down the walls of Jerusalem and the temple of God, and would lead people into captivity. This happened on 3 different occasions. Daniel was a Jewish man who was taken captive during the first attack on Israel, and was one of the guys who was brought into Babylon, into the city of Babylon, in which is today Iraq, modern day Iraq, and he was brought in to serve in the palace of the king Nebuchadnezzar. So we're going to pick up as his story starts off. So look here in verse 3. Then the king, and that is Nebuchadnezzar, instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs. And I just want to pause here and make sure you know what a eunuch is. First, eunuchs were castrated men who would serve in the palace of the king. And that's usually why they were castrated, because they would be near the princesses and the queen, and the king didn't want them being involved with them at all, wanted to have no temptation. So anybody who would serve in the palace would become a eunuch. But these eunuchs would be dedicated to study, to learning, and would become the king's chief counselors. This was true in many Eastern cultures, that the eunuchs would essentially run the country for the most part. So on the one hand, being a eunuch was actually an elevated, important position that wielded a lot of power. On the other hand, it was a very unfortunate situation because of the process that you went through to become a eunuch, and especially in Daniel and his friends' cases, because they were forced into this. So the master of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, we're told to bring some of the children of Israel, some of the king's descendants, and that means the king of Israel at the time, Jehoiakim, the king's descendants, some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, who were good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and to whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans, that word Chaldean is just another word for Babylonian. So what the king is essentially telling Ashpenaz is he says, take some of the princes, take some of the nobility, bring them into the palace, make sure that they're the ones who are smart, who are wise, who are good looking, who are strong, and we're going to make them eunuchs, and then teach them the wisdom and the literature of our people. We want to instruct them so they can fill this position as a leader in our empire. And so he does that. Verse 5, and the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies, that is his food, and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. So these men who were brought in were given 3 years of training. They were expected to eat from the king's delicacies. And just a word on that, the food that they would be expected to eat would consist of lots of things, but amongst other things, it would consist of meat that had been sacrificed to the gods of the Babylonians. Because, of course, in the culture of antiquity, meat was always sacrificed to gods. Eating meat was a special occasion. You didn't do it every single day like we do in America. It wasn't an all-the-time thing. It was a thing that you did at festivals and get-togethers. And when you did it, you offered it on an altar. And no joke, if you read descriptions of ancient altars, they were barbecues with grates. These were barbecues. You would come, you would cook the meat, you would offer it to the god, and then you would eat it. That was what happened in whenever you basically ate meat. So Daniel and his friends were expected to eat food that had been sacrificed to Nebuchadnezzar's gods. And to drink wine, also another thing, the wine before it was drank would be poured out as a sacrifice, part of it, to the gods. So all food that was taken in had been offered to the gods, which the law of Moses said was a no-no. You weren't allowed to eat that stuff or drink that stuff. Now, verse 6, from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Three names that you probably are not super familiar with, but as it says here, Daniel and his three friends, it says that they were given new names. To them, the chief of the eunuchs gave these names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. And those three, of course, are famously the three who will be cast in the fiery furnace. We just sang the song about one in the fire. That comes from Daniel 3, the three men in the furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, so I want to pause here. I want to talk about wisdom and culture. What does this have to do with wisdom and culture? Well, I want you to think about Daniel's situation and what wisdom, because Daniel is known as being a wise man, meant in that world. And I think you can maybe reap some basic principles, the basic principles that I want to kind of communicate to you. Before I get into talking about Daniel's situation and his circumstances, I want to talk about our culture. And I want to talk about Christians and their relationship to our culture. You see, because I do think that we're confused in a big way as to how we're supposed to interact with it. And I want to point out that I think increasingly, especially over the last, probably 7 or 8 years, Christians have increasingly had a sense of fear or anxiety that the culture is kind of blocking us out, is kind of stamping out our cultural existence, or is expecting us to change our traditions and our views. And with that comes a reaction. Sometimes we react angrily and we feel this sense that we have to fight. And we feel like if we don't fight, something really bad is coming, okay? And it often carries with it very apocalyptic types of helplessness or senses of helplessness that people have. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and I want to talk about Daniel's situation and I think what we can mine from him in this. Now, in doing this, I want to talk about just 3 aspects of our culture that I think gives us fear, rightly or not. Some of it may be rightly, some of it maybe not as much, but it causes us to be afraid, I think, as Christians, and we struggle with knowing how to interact and how to respond to it. And our desire is to control it and to change it and to make it different and to make it fall into line with what we think and with what we believe. Now, there are many things about our culture that could be identified as being somewhat antagonistic to who we are as Christians. I can't go into all of them. I can't go into some of the main ones. I mean, we live in a culture that is increasingly irreligious, that increasingly thinks of religion as bad, while spirituality is good, or something along those lines. Increasingly agnostic and atheist, increasingly doubtful about the idea of miracles. There are all sorts of things which could give us pause. But I want to just highlight 3. I want to just talk about 3 particular things that strike me as very big issues in the world that we live in, to kind of illustrate the struggle that we have. The first is the rise of addictive technology on demand, right? That, wanting to make sure to make the disclaimer that technology affords us many blessings and many gifts. There are many good things from technology. With it comes a lot of scary stuff. All right. There's a book that came out a couple years ago now by a guy named Adam Alter called Irresistible, where he highlights some of the real problems that are coming out with our use of addictive technology. He pointed out something that just was kind of mind-blowing to me. He pointed out that since the advent of the iPhone, since it came out in 2007, humans have lost 1/4 of their attention span. A full 1/4 Humans on average. And he said we test this by putting a neutral object in front of a person and seeing how long it will take before a person's attention veers away from that neutral object just out of a lack of interest. In 2007, we had a 12-second attention span, which, by the way, not very high, actually. Keep in mind that in 2007, we already had TV, we already had video games, we already had movies, we had computers, we had lots of stuff. We just didn't have the iPhone, okay? We didn't have the smartphone, basically. The smartphone didn't exist. Since then, we've dropped down to 8 seconds. Okay, now keep in mind, too, that 8 seconds is the average, right? So lots of people have way higher than 8 seconds. So there are people with much lower than 8 seconds. Put this in a little bit of perspective. A goldfish has 9-second attention span. So we've actually reached a point where our attention span is weaker than a goldfish. To put this another way, I'll put this another way, because I really want to convey why this matters, because it might not matter to some people, but it's a big deal, because it prevents us from being able to listen to people. And it prevents us from being able to understand what people are saying and what people think and what they're arguing. And I think one of the places where this really manifests itself in a super unfortunate way are presidential debates. A presidential debate, there was just one, a week ago, right, for the Democratic candidates, the first one of the season. Don't worry, we got 2 more years of it, right, before it's all done, if you missed that one. The basic format is a question is asked, a candidate has about 1 minute, 30 seconds to answer, and then people have 30 seconds to rebut. We've all had arguments. Could you imagine if you get 1 minute, 30 seconds to make your point? You get 30 seconds to respond. How could you possibly say anything substantive or important in that amount of time? How could you possibly say something that might be meaningful and something that might actually persuade somebody in such a short period of time? Now, let me contrast this. Actually, before I contrast this, let me say this. This design is on purpose because the assumption is that humans can't sit long enough to listen to fully fleshed out responses, right? They're dedicated. Like, if you notice during the presidential debates, at least later ones, no commercial breaks. They make it very short. They don't want people leaving because we can't stay put and listen. And this is for the highest office of the land. In theory, the guy that we're supposed to trust implicitly, but we can't listen long enough to hear what they have to say. Now, contrast this with 1858. Abraham Lincoln was running against Stephen Douglas for a Senate seat in Illinois. Okay, Senate seat. When's the last time you listened to a senatorial debate? I don't know that we have them. And if we did, I certainly wouldn't know how to find them or to watch them. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, when Lincoln and Douglas debated, they toured throughout the state of Illinois. And when they went, everyone from town came. Everybody flooded to hear these. Young and old, 8-year-old children, 5-year-old children, everybody came to watch these debates. And the debates lasted, on average, 9 hours. Okay? 9 hours. And nowadays you'd say a 7-year-old can't sit through 9 hours of talking. They can. They just have really, really learned not to. You know what I mean? So this matters. It matters in our ability to communicate with each other. It matters in terms of our ability to understand things. This is problematic. This is really problematic. It forces us to make all of our points through sound bites. How do you preach the gospel and talk about the wonders of Jesus in sound bites? How do you think about the heavy issues of the world in sound bites, in little minute talks? You can't do it. This is a problem. This is a real problem. And aside from that, of course, you have all the other consequences of it, right? You know, the average American spends 4 hours on their iPhone a day, or on their smartphone a day. 4 hours. That seems like a lot. I don't know if you guys have tested yourselves, like if you've had an app telling you how much you use it. I use it 4 hours. Almost every day, 4 hours. During the school year, when I work, I do it 4 hours a day. And I don't touch my phone when I'm at work, okay? During the summer, it's like 6 hours for me. And I am one of those guys who thinks he never uses it. Like if I'm with friends, if I'm hanging out with people, I don't touch it. Anybody here who's had coffee with me, I never pull out a phone. Never. I don't touch it. I have no problem with that. The phone is off. I don't think about it. And there are people, and I'm sorry if I'm calling you out. You guys know them, though, if you're not them, who do that. You can be talking like, yep, yeah, the whole time. Some people are on constantly. They have no ability to stop, right? I've talked to people who employ people, and they say, don't know how to get people to focus on the job. They're too busy on their phones, right? This isn't even beginning to touch really the real problems. Tucker's mentioned it before, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's been demonstrated and proven that there is a correlation between an increased use of this technology and increased suicide rates in the United States, increased depression, and it makes sense, right? We now live in a world where you can see what your friends are doing at all times, and you know when they didn't invite you to something, and you're constantly evaluating yourself in light of what you're looking at, thinking my life isn't as good as that, and you're thinking I have to make my life look as good as that. And also it has been demonstrated that likes on Instagram and Facebook, it sets off dopamine in I don't want to overstate this, but whenever I hear them talking about the setting off of dopamine in your brain, they liken it and compare it to the use of heroin. Right, so it's scary stuff. It's scary stuff. This is a cultural problem. The second cultural problem I wanted to reference, which I think is in many ways connected to the first, is this increasing socio-political discord. If I want to state this simply, we all hate each other as Americans, right? And probably more than just Americans. I think everybody who's plugged in, right? We think everybody who disagrees with us is evil. I mean, there's no gray area. There's no attempt to stop and say, what is their perspective? Where are they coming from? Why do they think this way? It is just, they are markedly evil. And who knows where that line of reasoning is going to lead people? You know what I mean? You can go back and study history. Look at the French Revolution. French Revolution, people are like, oh, these guys who we disagree with, they're just bad. We have to do something about them. And it's already resulted in violence. And it's only destined to probably get worse. But there's a second effect, not just the violence that is potentially scary. Or it's not even scary, it's a problem for us. And that is that this discord forces us to polarize and to pick teams. In every kind of setting, right? There are political groups. You've got to be a Republican, or you've got to be a Democrat, or you've got to be a liberal or a progressive, or you've got to be a libertarian or whatever. There's the political side of things, and you've got to pick that team, and that team's got to be number one. That team is so important. But it's not just that. It's not just political groups. It's social groups. It might be whatever. It could be like your ethnic, cultural background. It could be your hobby. We all have all sorts of communities that we identify as like our number one thing. And I have, by the way, no problem with any of those things in and of themselves. It's problematic when it becomes your defining characteristic. It's problematic when it supplants the kingdom of God, when being on that team becomes number one, and when that team's goals supplant those of the Gospels. And that's what's happening in our culture. And thirdly, and this is one I think, of these three, the ones that I think most evangelical Christians probably think of when they're thinking about the badness of the culture, I don't think that it's necessarily the worst facet or even the scariest, but I think for a lot of evangelical Christians, it feels scary because it feels like the part of our tradition and our culture that is changing the most. And that is, of course, the massive rejection and change of sexual customs and mores. Right? Once upon a time, the Christian church had very clear views on these things. One man, one woman, married for life. And there was grace and there was mercy for that not being fulfilled, but there was never a change in terms of what that was and what it meant. And now there's so much pressure, so much social pressure to say that's wrong in lots of different ways, right? And that we've got to backtrack and we've got to change that, and that there's a new system out there. And a lot of Christians get scared thinking of this because they're like, wait a minute, this is ultimately undermining 2,000 years of our culture and our heritage. And it's not just about about sex per se, but it's about the family, and it's about masculinity and femininity and you know what it means to be a man of God and a woman of God. All of these things are coming under question and change, and it scares people. And what does it do? It makes people angry, and it makes people want to seize control, and it makes people want to fix it, and it makes people want to have the right leaders in charge, and it makes people want to make sure, you know, that we have people representing our interests, and we have the right president and the right Supreme Court justices, and we feel like all of this stuff has to happen or we're in trouble. And we put our trust in those things. Now, Daniel. Why did I bring up Daniel? Well, think about Daniel. Daniel was a Jew. His identity was in being a member of the people of Israel. That was the number one most important thing to him. He is taken from his homeland. Read through the Psalms. There are a series of Psalms that were written by Jews who were in exile in Babylon. And you know what they're singing about all the time? Zion, Jerusalem, their home. He's taken from his home. He just wants to be there. That's stripped from him. He's taken to a new land, and he's made a eunuch. He's castrated. What does the Bible say? What did the law of Moses, Deuteronomy 23, verse 1, what did it say about people who were castrated? It said they would be cast out from their people, that they would have no inheritance amongst the people of Israel. This is in Daniel's head. He had no control over it. I don't want to be a eunuch, but you're making me do it. And as a result, I'm forfeiting my inheritance in God's people. And then his name, Daniel's name, meant judged of God. El, the God of the Hebrews. But the king of Babylon said, that's not your name. Your name is Belteshazzar. Bel is the god of the Babylonians. Daniel's name, what he was called every day of his life for the rest of his life, by the king and by other ministers, is Bel is king. Daniel had to live with that, right? He's essentially a slave. He has no ability to change these things. There is no hope. There's no new king to be elected. There's no new fix. And so my first basic point is this: don't be afraid of these things, right? Don't be afraid, because we want power and we want control, and we feel like power and control will fix the problems of the culture, but they won't. They don't. You have to realize Daniel's situation was awful, and our situation, by the way, is not awful. I don't want to make it sound like I don't think things are horrible for people in America, for Christians in America today, not at all. But we fear that it's going to get that way. And so don't fear. It might end up like Daniel, but that's okay. Let's see what Daniel did. Look at verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Okay, so Daniel looks at the food that was sacrificed to idols and the wine, and he says, in spite of what's happened to me, in spite of the fact that I'm theoretically kicked out of the people of God, in spite of the fact that I'm called Bel is king every day, I am not going to eat meat sacrificed to idols. I'm going to take a stand right now. And he purposed in his heart he would not be defiled with that. But guys, even though he purposed with that, he didn't have control of it. He had to go to Ashpenaz. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So he went to his boss and he said, please don't make me do this. But look, God had brought Daniel into the favor and the goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. The eunuchs Ashpenaz liked Daniel. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king who has appointed your food and drink. Why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So essentially, Daniel goes to Ashpenaz, who likes him, and says, I can't eat this meat. I can't drink this wine. Please don't make me do it. And Ashpenaz goes, Daniel, I like you. I don't want to make you do it. But the king is going to have my head if you end up being weak because you're not eating his food. If he comes to me and says, why do these guys look so bad? And I tell him, well, they haven't been eating the meat. And he says, why? And he says, because I asked, he's going to kill me. So look what Daniel says. This is wisdom, by the way. Verse 11. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, So deal with your servants. Please, Ashkenaz, just for 10 days, let us eat vegetables and drink water. And at the end of that 10 days, compare us. See who looks stronger. See who looks healthier, us or those who are eating the meat and the wine. So what does it say? He consented with them in this matter. So he allowed it to happen. And, verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. They chose to resist this command, and God honored them and made them look better, stronger, fleshier, fatter in a good way, stronger than all the rest of them. Verse 16, thus the steward took away their portion of the delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables for the rest of their training. He did what Daniel wanted. Verse 17, and as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. What points to take away from this? The first one I've already stated. The first one is power, control over your culture and your circumstances, which we all want, is not the answer. That doesn't fix anything. You don't have to have all of the ducks in a row that you want governmentally or societally to be happy in this world or to thrive as a Christian. Remember that some of the greatest times in Christian history were times when Christians had no control, right? The first 3 centuries of the church, Christians were a persecuted minority by Roman emperors. You read the literature. They weren't sitting there complaining about how bad the emperor was. They weren't complaining about how mean Romans were treating them. They lived their lives in simplicity, and sometimes that meant them dying. But you know what their response to that was? The great church father Tertullian says, the blood of our martyrs is the seed of our church. You kill one of us, 10 more grow up in their place. That's fine, right? They had the same mindset that Daniel had. You might make me a eunuch. You might force me into slavery. You might change my name. That's okay. I don't have control of it, and that's fine. But what did he do? This is the second point that is fully related. He took a stand. He was obedient, and he was faithful to God in the areas that he could be. And that's the major takeaway from this sermon, I think. You have to ask yourself, in your sphere of influence, in your context, where do you take a stand? And please, I don't want you to misunderstand me. I don't want you to think that in this sermon I'm telling you don't bother to vote, don't get involved with politics, don't try to organize and do things as a club. I'm not saying that at all. Those things are fine. Just don't trust in those things to be the answer. That's all. Daniel made a decision. I'm not going to eat the king's meat. You know what? They could have made him. And he would have taken a stand elsewhere, because that's who Daniel was. You take a stand where you can. You be faithful and obedient in your context. What does that mean for you? I don't know. It's different for all of us. For some of you, it might be political activism or something along those lines. But I think for most of us, it's things like how you father your children or mother your children, how you live in your family, how your place of employment, your place of work. When you're asked to fudge numbers on the books or something like that, and you think, no, I'm a Christian, I'm supposed to have integrity in this context. You take a stand even when your boss is telling you no. Or if you see an opportunity and you know you can get the better of somebody, you go, no, I'm not going to do that. I would rather I be wronged than that I wrong somebody else. You take a stand, being faithful to God's word. And then the third point, the only buddy who really can control it, the only one who really can affect the change is God himself. What is the answer of all of this? God blessed Daniel and his friends with wisdom and understanding. But it's more than that. Remember, I said his circumstance was so bleak. It was so bad. He was cast out of Israel. When I first thought of that, I thought that's horrible. But guess what? According to the letter of the law, I guess it was true. But guess what? Here we are. We have the scripture. Don't turn there, but Ezekiel 14:14, God praises Daniel in a way very few others have ever been praised. He talks about how Israel's going to face more judgment, and he says, it's so wicked that even if these 3 righteous men lived there, and he cited Noah, Job, and Daniel. And he said, even if those 3 righteous men lived in the city, they would only be able to save themselves for their righteousness. They couldn't save everybody else. He is an exemplary Israelite. He is not only one of the people, he is one of the special people of God. And here we are. Remember his name change? His whole life. Day after day, he had to hear Belteshazzar, Belteshazzar, Bel is king, Bel is king, Bel is king. Here we are 2,800 years later. What do we call him? Daniel. That's his name. They couldn't change his name. You see, the culture is not the ultimate reality. Changes all the time. We don't have control over it. So don't try to control it. Be obedient to God's word. Be faithful in what he's called you to do. And then trust God to take care of the rest. And I'm telling you, that's wise. And it'll make you a lot happier.